Good morning. Rediscovery. Today is Sunday, August 23rd. I'm Irv Wolf, and it's my privilege to take you through chapter 7 of Ecclesiastes on the search for real quality of life. If you don't have the notes already, well, Joel Franz should have sent those out to you, and hopefully you can follow along in the notes, and I'll be teaching straight from those notes, so I'm not going to deviate a whole lot, but hope they're understandable to you and that it's something that'll prove beneficial for you. Well, let me just say that we are healthy, Elsie and I, and hope you are as well. I continue to meet every Friday morning with Ron Griffin and Dale Erickson, my co-partners in crime, and we have a great time together. We get a chance to pray for you and a chance to pray for our church, and then also to go over teaching, who's doing what. And this is my week, and next week is Pastor Ron Griffin. Well, is real quality of life, is that found in the good old days, or is it found in a sizable inheritance that we pass on to our children, grandchildren? Is real quality of life found in those things? That's what we want to answer from chapter 7. Were the good old days better than today? Solomon has comments concerning that. He also has comments concerning a sizable inheritance. Is that where the good life is found? Is the good life found in a sizable inheritance? Look at those who have, quote unquote, the good life. People like Jeff Bezos, by the way, whose wife divorced him, and he's now paying out $1 billion in inheritance, or not inheritance, but in a divorce settlement to her. What about Bill Gates? What about Michael Bloomberg, Sam Walton and his family, Kirk Carlson and his family? All of them have sizable inheritance that they'll pass on to their children or have already passed on to their children. Does that ensure the good life? Is the inheritance the path to a good life? We'll have some thoughts on that and listen to what Solomon says about that. Solomon, as you know, is the wisest man who ever lived. He asked God for wisdom, and God gave him wisdom as well as wealth and fame and power. Well, from verses 1 through 10 of chapter 7, I search for quality of life in clinging to the past. In other words, the good old days, but I couldn't find it. Let me read verses 1 through 10. A good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of death better than the day of birth. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, for death is the destiny of every man. The living should take this to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, because a sad face is good for the heart. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. It's better to heed a wise man's rebuke than listen to the song of fools. Like the crackling of thorns under the pot, so is the laughter of fools. This too is meaningless. Extortions turn a wise man into a fool. A bribe corrupts the heart. The end of a matter is better than in the beginning, and patience is better than pride. Do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, for anger resides in the lap of fools. And then here's our key verse. Do not say, why were the old days better than these? For it is not wise to ask such a question. Well, Solomon declares that it isn't wise to say that the good old days were better than today. But nostalgia is coming back in. I don't know if you've noticed it, but Time Warner sells an awful lot of CDs, 50s, 60s, and 70s music, so you can listen to all kinds of the oldies that you grew up with and the oldies that you enjoy today. TV shows are coming back in. A lot of the old reruns, Happy Days, Home Improvement, Three's Company, Hogan's Heroes, all of those are coming back in and are back on TV again in rerun form. Reunion specials for Gilligan's Island, now they're all 30 years older than they were when they did the show. But Gilligan's Island, Brady Bunch, Three's Company, all of those shows have had reunion specials. And then what about the PBS specials with all the old bands who are trying to make a comeback, or at least they're using the old bands to raise funds like PBS does? Peter, Paul, and Mary, even John Fogerty and the Fogerty family. He was the lead singer for Creedence Clearwater Revival. They're using those kinds of old bands to attract attention. Even crew cuts are coming back in. I noticed my 40-some-year-old son has now a crew cut that's just a throwback to when I was a kid in high school, but he has a crew cut. And my question is, are we going to see big hair for women, like some of those beehives and other hairdos that were very popular back in the 60s? And what about fashion? Can it be that poodle skirts and bobby socks and penny loafers are far behind? Something's got to replace those skinny jeans and leggings. Those are pathetic. Why do people idealize the past? Well, here's some thoughts for you. One thing is selective memory. The good old times were not necessarily all good old times. We selectively remember the good times and we conveniently forget the bad times. It was a simpler time in our youth, meaning less stress, less pressure, fewer complications back in those days. This is a real true one today. There is consensus back in the old days, consensus morality. America had consensus of values. We were never really a Christian country. We've always been pluralistic with people of Jewish persuasion, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, you name it, atheists. But there was always a moral consensus that was based on biblical values. And so there was a consensus of values in this country. So in that sense, the good old days were considerably better than they are today. There were a greater number of intact nuclear families. Remember, the configuration was a working dad, a stay-at-home mom, and 2.5 children. That's what it was in the good old days when you and I were growing up. It was a lot safer society. Rising crime and violence of today was just not around back then. In schools and in class, the greatest offenses were chewing gum in class and running in the hallways. Nowadays, it's carrying weapons, rape, murder, beatings. So it's escalated in violence significantly. And then life was just slower back in the good old days. Nostalgia takes us back to pre-computers. When you and I were growing up, there were no computers. In fact, when computers came in, when I was in the Air Force, it was reputed that they would be so much more efficient and time-saving that we would reduce the work week from 40 hours a work week to 30 hours a work week. We would get that much more done in 30 hours than we did in 40, and we would have more free time. The exact opposite happened. It went from 40 hours a week to 50 hours a week because employers and others felt, wow, I can get so much more done. Increased productivity. Richard Swenson, in his book Margin, Dr. Swenson notes that it didn't produce the results that we idealized. So were the good old days really that good? Well, there was immorality. It was around, but it was hidden. It was pushed underground. It was secret. The good old days of the 1920s through the 50s, that 40-year generation, sowed seeds that produced the rebellious flowers of the 60s through the 90s, which in turn have produced the bitter fruit of the 2000s through the 2030s. In the good old days, dads were providers, but they were emotionally distant and pretty uninvolved with their families. They felt that their task was to provide and protect, but they weren't connecting the way they needed to with their children. And so the free love movement of the 60s, in my opinion, was a cry for father love, for father discipline, and father involvement. It was an indictment on emotionally distant fathers. And if you think back about it, you'll see that that is probably the case in your family. I know it certainly was in mine, in which my dad worked hard. And he was gone from morning early. We never even saw him when he left until late at night. And he would come home after we'd all been fed, and he would eat dinner by himself with my mom. And just pretty much uninvolved with us. Occasionally, he would do things like attend a baseball game, a Little League game that I played. But for the most part, pretty emotionally distant. The good old days will always seem better because you and I were children back in the good old days, and we had less stress and we had less pressure. Our parents had all of that. And now, for us back then, the sewer was out of sight, but now it's backed up into our living rooms and into our world. Homosexuality was underground back then. Drugs and alcohol addiction were pretty remote. Needle Park. We saw a movie called Days of Wine and Roses with Lee Remick and with, who am I thinking of? Not Walter Matthau, who was it? Anyway, the other guy. But Lee Remick was in it. Affairs of the presidents were pretty much kept under wrap. You never heard about Eisenhower's affairs as he cheated on Mamie. You never heard too much about John Kennedy's affairs as he cheated on Jacqueline. Pornography. Pornography was pretty much kept under wraps back then. It was an occasional French magazine that somebody imported. It was Esquire with their line drawings of nudes. And it was National Geographic with photos of the Aborigines. White-collar crime, embezzlement, maybe. Political corruption. There was Tammany Hall in New York way back when. And in our day and age, President Richard Nixon and the Watergate conspiracy. Also in the past, the media chose not to report everything that they knew. They just were selective, and they tended to preserve people's reputation. Nothing is hidden now, and nothing is not exposed by the media. So the good old days, quality of life is not found in the good old days. Well, what about quality of life from inherited wealth? Solomon says, I searched for quality of life and inherited wealth, but I couldn't find it there either. Here's verses 11 through 14. Wisdom, like an inheritance, is a good thing and benefits those who see the sun. Wisdom is a shelter, as money is a shelter. But the advantage of knowledge is this: wisdom preserves the life of its possessor. Consider what God has done. Who can straighten what he has made crooked? When times are good, be happy. When times are bad, consider. God has made the one as well as the other. Therefore, a man cannot discover anything about his future. So Solomon says that inheritance accompanied by wisdom is good and advantageous. He says that in verse 11. He goes on to say, both are a protection and a guard for us. Well, financial inheritance. Let's talk about that for just a minute. It is a hedge against the future. It can protect us by providing financial resources to buy things like houses and cars and college education for our kids and our grandkids. It enables us to start a business, to retire, and still hopefully maintain the same standard of living that we had when we were working. It provides for hospitalization, geriatric care, and for any emergency crisis. So wealth has its benefits there. And a nest egg to start an inheritance for your children. They have something called a 529 plan, in which parents can contribute tax-free towards the education of their children. And even though you, as a grandparent, can't contribute to it, it has to be the parent, you can, however, contribute to your grandkids through their parents, and they can put it in the 529. They get the benefit of the tax deduction, something you don't, but you get the knowledge that you're helping them go to college or to trade school debt-free. Well, wisdom is an even better hedge for the future. It's a hedge for all time, present and future. It protects us by helping us make sound decisions. Boy, we need that, don't we? And so do our politicians, and so do our business leaders. We can learn from our experience as a wise person and from the mistakes of the past. We can benefit from observing the failings of others. We can know the will of God. If we are wise, we can avoid sin. We can avoid foolishness. We can just have good old common horse sense to know what's the right thing to do. We can know when and where and what and how to speak to other people if we are wise, and we can anticipate future events by seeing the handwriting on the wall, and you know what's coming. That's what wisdom has going for it. It's been around the block a while, and it knows what the signs are, and it sees things coming before they happen. Something that psychologists call EQ, emotional quotient, or just like an intelligent quotient, EQ, emotional quotient, helps you think ahead and say what's coming down the pike and see the signs and see where you need to make corrections and changes. Well, I've given you in your notes a whole lot of scriptures. I hope you'll take the time to look them up because they directly bear in on you and the inheritance that you will leave to your children and grandchildren. So there's about 8 passages there for you to consider, and by all means learn from them. Well, what's the downside to inherited wealth? There is a downside to it. The old saying is you didn't earn it, so you don't value it. And that's true. With an inheritance, you didn't earn it. You just stuck out your hand and somebody put a check in it and you didn't earn it. So the tendency is not to value it because you have no skin in the game. Secondly, without wisdom, you will lose or squander it. Consider the prodigal son in Luke 15. He took his share of the inheritance and he went and lost it on wine, women, and song. And the next thing you know, he's totally broke and hires himself out to a Gentile pig farmer. Thirdly, inheritance can provide a sense of false security. You think to yourself, now that I've got this big nest egg, I can trust gold rather than trusting God. And you know, God always comes before gold in the dictionary. Fourthly, an inheritance can warp our values. We can become something that we really aren't. We can think that we're all that in a bag of chips. We can take on the lifestyle of the rich and famous. We can become proud and arrogant and self-important and pompous and ego-inflated, almost like we earned what we just inherited from our ancestors. Fifthly, we can warp our children by leaving an inheritance to them if they've not even been trained in how to handle money wisely. They need to be trained before we give them a dime. And then we can pass it on to them, I think, sequentially in bite-sized chunks rather than giving them a lump sum, which is huge and which they won't value. If you give it to them and kind of chunk the inheritance to them, if they've been trained in how to handle money and how to be wise, they will value it and it'll be a benefit to them. Inheritance can undermine our spiritual life. That's another downside to it. It can cause us to abandon our faith. More people are spiritually corrupted by money than by poverty. That's true. There's a couple of verses to point that up. Well, let me say in conclusion, finding real quality of life is not easy. Solomon attests to that. The world looks to the frosting on the cake as real quality of life, but the frosting is sweet and it tastes good and makes your eyes light up and shine, but it doesn't last, and too much of it makes you sick. We come away empty, and inside we have the gnawing feeling that there must be something more to life than this. We want the cake, not just the frosting. Guess what? God's the cake. He's built us for himself. He has made a God-shaped vacuum, which only he can fill in our soul. He's the real quality of life, and apart from him, all else is emptiness and frosting. Well, that's it for this week. God bless you. Have a safe week, and look forward to seeing you someday in person. Take care. Bye-bye.